So our agenda for today is pretty straightforward. After this very brief introduction, we will then move straight on to our two excellent speakers. So our first speaker will be Christine Camacho, who's a consultant in public health and also a PhD fellow at the University of Manchester. We will then move secondly on to Andrea Allegra, who's a senior resilience officer at the Kent Fire and Rescue Service. So both Christine and Andrea will speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then that will leave us towards the end with a good amount of time in terms of the Q&A session. So this webinar is obviously focused on new approaches to measuring community resilience and vulnerability. And this is obviously something that's very important to the work of the National Consortium. So ways of identifying need within society and priority groups during disruption is obviously key to the kind of work that we've been doing through the National Consortium in relation to creating a local resilience capability. So and I'm sure all of you really look forward to hearing the different perspectives and the approaches that Christine and Andrea have been using in their particular context in terms of the use of data and mapping. And obviously, I'm sure that that the presentations will really bring forth lots of questions from you. But before handing you over to Christine, just have a couple of dates and as well as other reminders just for your diaries. So the next webinar, we have already produced the link and the event details for. So this will form part of a kind of a mini series leading up to the 3rd National Conference on Societal Resilience, which we're badging under the What Works, What Doesn't and Why. And our next webinar on the 20th of November at 4 p.m. UK time will focus on resilience insights from community groups. So we have 3 community groups lined up for that. After I've finished, I will add the registration link to the chat, but the details will also then be circulated through, the various channels that we have, including the emails and LinkedIn. We have our major kind of in-person event then coming up in March of 2025 on the 10th and 11th. The 3rd National Conference on Societal Resilience. So you can obviously see the conference web page address there. I will also then add that to the chat function later on. And we obviously will welcome many of you both from the UK, but also internationally, hopefully to the conference in March. In terms of keeping up to date, so the webinars recordings are all available via the NCSR web pages. So this recording will also be made available at some point during this week. And obviously you can share it with your networks or you can listen and watch back to. You can obviously then keep up to date in terms of our various publications and resources, as well as then the events that we organize via our LinkedIn. And we obviously undertake these webinars then jointly with the Resilience Beyond Observed Capabilities Network Plus project. So I would encourage you to check out the webpage of the RBOC network and see the various scenarios in relation to that particular project. So I think without further ado, I'll stop sharing, and Christine will be able to then share her slides, and then we can move straight into the first presentation once Christine is ready. So yeah, that's working well, Christine. So please go ahead.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone, and good morning. And it's lovely to have so many people on the call here today. So Andrew's already kindly introduced me, so I'll skip that bit. And I'm going to be talking today about some research that's been published just over this summer. So this is new research on developing a community resilience index for England. So the aim of this research was to develop a way of trying to measure community resilience. And I'm going to talk you through some of the background to that. That the framework that it's based on, the Baseline Resilience in Communities framework, and to talk about how we've adapted that framework for the context of this country. So thinking more about chronic and long-term shocks rather than a specific focus on natural hazards. How we chose some of those indicators and some of the policy implications of that. So to start off with, thinking about what community resilience is, and it's a really difficult thing to define. Most papers about community resilience start off with their own definition of it, but the way we've thought about it is quite broad. So it's thinking about communities, how places can cope with and recover from shocks and a range of different shocks. And we're thinking about, it's quite close, I think, to the way that societal resilience is conceived, in that it's the people in a place, the resources that they have, the institutions that are there to support them. And the analogy of the trees there is thinking about, on the left, a tree or a community that has very deep roots, it's healthy, it's very well embedded, compared to the tree on the right, that looks like it might have some kind of disease, and it doesn't have the same strong roots into the ground. And so if a shock comes along, that tree on the right is less likely to fare well as a result of that. So why set about trying to measure community resilience? Well, community resilience, as you'll know, is kind of talked about in a lot of policies. We want to build resilience, but how would we know whether we've actually built resilience unless we can measure it in the first place? And there's no existing framework for doing that in this country. So we're not really able to identify those places that have lower resilience and understand why they might have lower resilience, and therefore to actually develop targeted interventions. And we also don't know whether an intervention that's aimed at building resilience has been successful. And this need is actually recognised within the government's resilience framework, which was released at the end of 2022. And this had a specific aim in it to develop a measurement of socioeconomic resilience. Now, whether that's quite the same thing as community resilience or not is debatable, but the idea being that we need some kind of measure. And this was a goal that the government said that they would achieve by next year. Okay, so I'm going to go on to talk about how we actually developed the index. So that the CRI up there is the Community Resilience Index. So I've already mentioned the baseline resilience indicators for communities framework. So I'm just going to start off by just giving a little bit of information about what that is. So this was developed by Susan Cutter and her group in the States. And in the first iteration of this, there were 5 different groups in here. So looking at social factors, economic, institutional, infrastructure, and community capital. And under each of those, there was indicators that were chosen. And there was 36 indicators in total. So you can see here that under infrastructure, for example, they were looking at the type of housing people were in, the availability for capacity, thinking about evacuation, etc. And then all of those indicators were kind of added up to make this composite resilience score. And this is the data from the original study. And this is showing counties in the southeast of the United States, an area, as we know, that is prone to natural hazards. And you can see the red areas here are the counties that they'd highlighted as having lower resilience. So that was the original BRIC study and how that was done. And in adapting this for England, one of the first things that we were thinking about is what indicators should we choose and how should we actually construct the index? So the first thing that we did with this is actually to do a systematic review. So we looked at all of the studies that had been published that had used the BRIC framework to measure resilience. And there was 32 studies in total. So the majority of these were done in the US, where the original study was done, also in China, and then a few dotted around the world. So any of these countries that are coloured in have had a BRIC study there. So there's been one in Brazil, one in Zimbabwe, and in Europe, there's been studies that have been done in Norway, Germany, and Italy, but nothing in England. And if you're if you're not from England and you're on this call today and your country isn't coloured in, there's an opportunity there to think about again whether the BRIC could be adapted to your context as well. So I'm not going to go into lots of detail about the methods, but this is one thing that I just wanted to touch on. So if I tell you that, for example, the community resilience score for Manchester was 84.5, you might want to know how on earth we arrived at that number. And I think that's really important when you're making a composite index, because what you're doing is you're taking lots and lots of different variables and you're processing them. And at the end of it, you're coming up with just one number. And what we need to make sure is that there's confidence in how that one number was arrived at. And this is a kind of an international framework that specifies the steps that should be followed when you are constructing a composite index. And this is to kind of give assurance that when you get to the end of that, the number that you're giving is robust. And in the systematic review, we looked at all of the studies that had used the baseline resilience indicators for communities and how many of those steps that they'd followed. And we didn't find any published studies that had followed all 10 steps. And this graph is just showing you which steps were followed better than others. So most studies described a theoretical framework and had a good rationale for selecting their data. But most didn't use any multivariate techniques, didn't use any sensitivity analysis, for example. So when we were developing the Community Resilience Index for England, we have followed all of those 10 steps in that framework to do that. So the indicators, we chose 44 indicators. These are the indicators that we chose. And we used that original BRIC framework to kind of think through which indicators to select. So for example, in infrastructure, we looked at household overcrowding, households in temporary accommodation, how far it would take to get to key services like health centres, etc., and also the level of broadband access. But what we did with these indicators is we then used a kind of a statistical method to group them into subdomains. So the subdomains that you'll see in the index are these ones here, and these indicators will come from a combination of those different categories of social, economic, etc. But this is how they are grouped, looking at the underlying properties of the data. And again, that's about that construction technique and trying to make sure that this is really robust. Okay, so now we're on to the results. So what we found is that the average Community Resilience Index score for England was 83.1. But what was more interesting really was the variation that we saw. So we did this at local authority district level, and there was 2 local authority districts that we excluded because they were very small. That's the City of London and the Isles of Scilly. So we have scores for 307 local authority districts across England. What we saw, the area with the lowest score was Tendring down here in the east of England, compared to the highest score, which was Elmbridge in the southeast. And you can see a really big gap between that lowest and highest score. We also see this pattern here. If you look around coastal areas, you can see a lot of this dark pink around the coast. So coastal areas have significantly lower scores than inland areas. We also found a gradient with rurality, again, where rural areas generally had lower resilience. At regional level, London had the highest score, so 95.2, and Yorkshire and Humber up here had the lowest score. So really a picture of like quite a lot of these kind of measures that we'd look at in England. We know that there is a lot of inequality in England, and these community resilience scores have kind of shown that as well. And these are those sub-indexes that I referred to earlier. So we can also break down those scores, looking at across each of these different sub-indices. So for example, if we look at access in infrastructure, and this sub-index was the most heavily weighted in the overall scores. Again, we see this pattern, particularly around coastal areas, having the lowest resilience in accessing infrastructure, but actually quite a good outcome for the North. The North did fairly well in this one. Whereas when we look at economic well-being and opportunities, there was a much clearer north-south divide in that indicator. So one of the suggested steps in developing an index is to compare it to an existing index. And so for this, we chose the index of multiple deprivation, which some people may be familiar with. It consists of 7 domains and is constructed from a number of indicators. And what we found is that resilience and deprivation had an opposite relationship, which is what we'd expect. So areas here that had lower deprivation tended to have higher resilience. And at the other end of this graph, the areas with higher deprivation tended to have lower resilience. And that relationship was significant, but it wasn't a really strong correlation. So you can see there's quite a lot of dots that go off this line. And when we look at that in a bit more detail, what we can see is that the sub-index that is measuring economic well-being and opportunity has a really strong negative correlation with deprivation. So that particular sub-index is kind of almost measuring the opposite to deprivation. But the correlations for some of these other sub-indices are much smaller and in some cases not significant. So what this is telling us is that the Community Resilience Index is measuring other things that are not captured in that deprivation index, particularly here around social capital and connectivity. So there was no kind of significant correlation between that and the index of multiple deprivation. And the other interesting thing that we looked at is areas that were outliers. And I'll pick a couple of these, but this top group here are positive outliers. So these are the areas that have done much better in terms of community resilience than we would expect them to from their level of deprivation. And what clearly stands out here is that 9 out of 10 of these are in London. So there's potentially a capital city effect here, where there's some kind of protective effects on resilience for these places. Whereas these bottom places are doing worse than we'd expect based on their level of deprivation. And if you compare here Fenland and Lambeth, these are actually next to each other in terms of their deprivation rank. So very similar in deprivation, but Lambeth had a community resilience index score of nearly 100 and Fenland of 56. So some very different things going on there. Okay, so I think I've got just a couple of minutes. I can probably show you this if it works, and hopefully there might be a link in the chat as well. So we've made all of the data from this study available to everyone via this tool. And I will just see if it will work for me to show you this. So if you just, can you see that on the screen? Can you see the tool, or are you still seeing my slides?
I can see that, Christine, and I've just added the link to the chat.
Brilliant, thank you. So hopefully you can see what I'm doing in this dashboard, but if not, you can look at it in the chat yourself. But you can select any local authority in the country here, and you'll be able to see the details of how that area is scored. And you can also pull up some of the detail here about all of the indicators to get a better idea of how that particular area has done. And within this, if you're interested as well in an area, for example, a local resilience forum, you can select the local resilience forum that you're interested in, and you will get the scores of all the local authority areas in that place. So that's just there as a resource, basically, so that people can have access to the data and explore it. Okay, so this research, we think, really kind of aligns with this aim that's in the government resilience framework, to better understand risk, to think about prevention and preparation, and how we can work with communities around some of that. The Community Resilience Index is a tool. It doesn't contain any answers within itself. It's trying to give a picture of what those scores look like, how they're patterned across the country and in different places. And the potential is for that tool to be used to better understand resilience, and potentially also to do things like guide the funding of allocation. We've had the Levelling Up Fund recently as a mechanism of place-based funding. I'm sure there'll be something new coming in to replace that. But if we're trying to understand the question of, well, how much should we give to where, then there's the potential to use these scores to try and guide some of those decisions. And to think, what are the interventions that are needed in particular places in order to build resilience? Because as this data has shown, that won't be a one-size-fits-all solution. And also the potential to actually repeat these measures and to track progress over time. And I'll let Chris Whitty have the last word here. So again, we've seen a increasing focus on resilience as a result of the COVID inquiry. And this was a quote that Chris Whitty gave. And hopefully some of this data from the Community Resilience Index is helping us to understand what some of those inequalities are, and to help set the scene for the work that needs to be done to address them. So thank you, and I'm happy to either take comments now or afterwards, Andrew, whichever you prefer.
Well, I think I see Nick Isherwood in with a question. So I think, Nick, I will let you come off mute just to ask this one question. But otherwise, I think I would just encourage people, as obviously Andrea will be coming up next, I would encourage people, if they have sort of precise queries or questions, to maybe add that to the chat. And obviously Christine might be able to answer them as Andrea is presenting. But Nick, you should be able to verbalize your question now, or take control of your own mic. Hi, Nick. Yeah, you're off.
Yes, thanks, Andrew.
Yeah,
The microphone kept going on and off, on and off.
That's okay.
Just for your info, I did try and put the question in the chat. It's saying chat is only available during the meeting, so I don't know whether that's something else that might need enabling. But a very quick question for you, please, Christine. I assume currently it goes down to local authority level and no further. Are there any plans to sort of extend that maybe down to super output areas, wards, or anything lower than local authorities?
Nick, that's a really good question. So we were kind of restrained by the availability of the data. So most of the data sets that we used kind of came from the census and were kind of reliably available at local authority district level. It is possible to kind of try and shrink that down to a lower geographical level. But then what you kind of end up doing is just averaging that same value across, say, all the super output areas in that district. So I think we are looking at other ways to kind of compile that data in different data sets. But one of the things that I think is in terms of this method is that it's a very top-down method. So we're using publicly available data. I think in terms of really getting a granular view of what's happening, say at a neighbourhood level or an LSOA level, I think there's something about also employing bottom-up methodologies in terms of how we actually engage with communities and get their views on the ground. Because there's some of the measures, I think it is limited in terms of how you can really capture some of those things around social cohesion and about how people really feel about the communities that they live in. I think to get that really accurately, you need to talk to people. So I think it's probably a combination of maybe trying to refine the data, but also use some different methods to get a more accurate kind of picture.
That's fantastic, Christine. Thanks for your answer, and thanks, Nick, for posing the question. As I said, we will have an opportunity then later on in the much longer Q&A session to pose more questions. I do see that a number of both comments and queries have been added to the chat. So thanks, Carl, for highlighting then the fantastic piece of work that obviously Christine has been involved in bringing together. So, but Christine, you may like to then check out some of the specific queries coming into the chat just as Andrea goes through his presentation. So, Andrea, please, if you're able to share your slides at this point, then we'll be able to get going. Thank you. Yes, so those are working well. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm just going to start from the beginning. Can you see it?
I can, yes, it's the first slide.
Yeah, perfect. So I'd just like to thank the consortium for providing us with an opportunity to present to you today, to present our work on social vulnerability in Kent. Martin Collins, our GIS analyst, was unable to participate in today's webinar. However, he will be available to address any question personally over the next few days, should I be unable to do so myself at the conclusion of this presentation. So I just want to provide some context on why we went down this route. The need to start investigating social vulnerability in Kent originates by three main factors. The first one is the geographical characteristic of Kent. It's a very vast territory comprising of 12 local authorities, districts, and the Medway Unitary Authority. It has 309 civil parishes in the Kent County Council area and a further 11 in the Medway Unitary Authority area. The second factor is something that may resonate with some of you, is the limited resources that the Kent Resilience team has in community resilience workstream. At the moment, there is myself and my colleague Sasha Taylor, which is our communication and engagement officer. So there is only two of us covering a very vast territory, and this situation made us realize very quickly that we needed to identify areas in the county where our work had to be prioritized. The third factor is the need to find a cost-effective, easy solution to support the identification of such areas where social vulnerability is affected by flood risk. This study explores a focused range of social vulnerability factors in relation to a particular natural hazard. In this case, it's flooding from rivers and sea, with some reference to surface flooding within the areas of Kent and Medway. It leverages open source data to identify communities that might require support in both their preparation for and response to the risk. The desired outcome of this study was the creation of a risk heat map that would help us to identify clusters of high vulnerability in Kent to allow our team to prioritize community resilience engagement work. So risk maps today play a very important role. They're a very important tool, and they play an essential role in disaster risk management by helping to mitigate the impacts of such events. This type of maps, risk maps, consolidate three essential pieces of information: the characteristic of the threat, the extent of vulnerability to that threat, and the population density, along with the potential risk to assets from the specific hazard. In recent time, those involving emergency preparedness have increasingly recognized the significance of social vulnerability. Efforts have been directed towards developing models that can accurately identify patterns of social vulnerability within communities, using mainly GIS system, geographic information system, and creating risk maps. So how do we identify social vulnerability in Kent and Medway? The research utilized publicly available data sets from the Office of National Statistics, the Census 2021 in the specific, along with flood data from the Environment Agency to create map projection that highlighted social vulnerability clusters in Kent and Medway. Both of these data sets are open source, which means they're obviously freely available. These projections were developed using dimension of deprivation within households, which derive from 4 specific household characteristics: health, education, employment, and housing. So the next slide is about the choice of hazard. Why do we choose flooding? Well, according to the Met Office, by 2040, we'll experience an average rainfall expected to increase significantly, making heavy rain and flooding major environmental threats. This trend may rise by 10 to 20% by 2040 and by 20 to 30% by 2080. Right now, Kent and Medway are at high risk of flooding from the sea, rivers, surface water, and groundwater. Many homes, farms, transport systems, and utility services in the area have already suffered from past flooding, leading to a high cost for local communities and the economy. So this slide is about the data that we use, which I mentioned earlier. We use the Environmental Agency Flood Risk Area 2023, which provided the hazard mapping information. This includes Zone 2, which has a 1% chance of river flooding or 0.5% from the sea, and Zone 3, which is the highest risk area with a 1% or greater chance of river flooding or 0.5% from the sea. Other flooding sources are not currently included in this study. For what concerns the social deprivation part of the modeling, we use data from the, as I said, from the 2021 census, with focus on output area level data about households that reported experiencing 1 to 4 type of deprivation in their questionnaire. So how do we go about? The first step was basically to create a flood risk map. So the data sets 2 and 3 from the A, where we conducted a calculation to assess the percentage of each output area at risk of flooding. The findings are represented on a map that depicts the flood risk, which is the one on screen now. The map offers an overview of the areas that could be affected by flooding, highlighting the general risk to community. The next set of maps were the creation of dimensional deprivation maps. These maps illustrate how different dimensions of deprivation are spread across Kent. They feature 1 to 4 dimensions of deprivation, along with a weighted map that merges all 4 indices. This approach, the one to add in a weight, was adopted because in some instances, a single household could face 4 unique types of deprivation, but in contrast, another area may have 100 households affected by just 2-dimensional deprivation, highlighting a much larger concern. The final map was basically a merge of the flood map with the last map of the displaying social deprivation, the clusters, which basically this final projection highlights critical regions of social vulnerability at risk of flooding. So conclusion and implication, as we saw in the previous slide, the hotspots analysis points out 2 areas in Kent where social vulnerability overlaps with high flood risk, showing how these factors combine. The report identifies 3 districts in Kent that are facing serious flooding issue, Swale, Thanet, and Folkestone and Ninth. These areas have a troubling mix of high social vulnerability and significant flood risk, which calls for urgent action. Sometimes these findings need further analysis for better understanding. Some vulnerable areas may include industrial sites, so we need to use a bit of fuzzy logic and possibly add more data from different sources to help us reach a clear conclusion. The report also includes a set of recommendations for each of the highlighted districts, which include a detailed description of the type of chronic social vulnerability present in each district. We use data from local insights to actually help us to create a better model, a better picture for these areas, a lower layer super up areas. So we basically, after conducting our preliminary analysis using the EA and the UNS data, we then also, once we identified the 3 critical areas, we also use data from local insight to kind of give us a better understanding of the social vulnerability in this region. So this is an important slide. Basically, the study was developed through an extensive literature review, which was focused on disaster management, risk and vulnerability, along with social characteristic data. However, while these sources offer valuable insight, the conclusions drawn are not definitive and warrant further investigation. So engaging with local welfare service providers through interviews can provide additional perspective that may either support or challenge the social vulnerability assessment of specific region. Additionally, talking directly to community members in diverse focus groups can help gather important qualitative information about local vulnerabilities and ensure that the chosen indicators remain pertinent. So what are the next steps for us? We're now going to proceed, now that the report has been completed, we will now start focusing on a series of action. These include the identification of regions that are expected to experience greater impacts, such as power outages and similar disruption due to climate change, ongoing monitoring of existing data and potential future data sources, along with an emphasis on risk and climate change, engage in regular engagement with partners in those key areas highlighted by the study to assess the current community resilience initiative in place and identify opportunities for enhancement. We also now we got access to Esri GIS. Those maps that you saw earlier were created by using MapOS, which is a more rudimental 2D kind of GIS platform. Now we got access to Esri, so we would like to create those projections with this new software, which hopefully will be better overall. We'll also proceed to the identification of marginalized groups within those target areas, ensuring they possess actionable plans and the necessary tools to advance their initiative autonomously. We'll start to examine existing groups and community networks with the target region, again, to see if there is any possible synergy can be created in resilience work. And we also now going to start in the process of creating a public dashboard, which will use SVGS technology to showcase community resources across the whole of Kent. We're also running an assessment of resources within the voluntary sector to bolster resilience initiative in those key areas. And then we'll start to present the project to our stakeholders in those districts and to start discussion on how to best collaborate to find to scope out, how to create synergy in community resilience workstream. So I'll leave it over to you. I'm going to stop sharing now. Stop sharing.
That's fantastic, Andrea. Thank you very much for taking us through then your use of data and mapping in the context of Kent and Medway. I think to start off with, just to let everyone know that we will ask people to raise their hands in terms of anyone who has specific questions. We do like it if people come off mute and our camera to verbalize your own questions. So that's why then if you raise your hands, then I'll be able to enable your microphone and your camera. Obviously, you can continue to add any queries to the chat function as well. And both Christine and Andrea will be able to look through those and obviously address them as we go along. But I think at this point, maybe if I could ask people to initially raise your hands in terms of first questions, and I can enable your mic. So I see David Mitchell. So if you just give me, so I have allowed your mic, David, and your camera. So you should have control. I see Stuart Marshall up next. So Stuart, I will also then enable both your mic and your camera. So please go ahead, David.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Apologies jumping in with a verbal question because the chat doesn't seem to be working for me. A fairly broad observation for Christine, please. It seems counterintuitive to me that the northwest of England scores relatively well on resilience. Anyone who lives here, and I presume that includes yourself, Christine, would suggest that doesn't quite fit the intuitive view of people who live here. It doesn't fit with some of the political discourse around deprivation in the northwest of England. Have you any views on why this index shows the northwest coming out relatively well, when most people would probably suggest it would be down there at the bottom?
Thanks, David. So I think all of the regions have a mix of areas that do less well and more well. So when I look at the data for the northwest, the areas that are scoring kind of particularly highly, so we've got areas in Ribble and South Ribble, we've got Trafford, Warrington, Stockport, Cheshire. So we do have quite a mix in the northwest, and it's also kind of driven by I suppose when we're looking at the deprivation scores, it's not just about deprivation. So we do have areas in the northwest that have higher levels of deprivation. But we've also had a lot of economic development, a lot of regeneration. We've got quite good road networks, and so it's a mix of all those factors. And I have kind of, shared this data as well with colleagues in the northwest, who kind of do recognise that the picture in the data. So I think with all of these, it's not to say that there aren't areas or parts of the northwest that will have issues, but as a region overall, we have done well in the northwest, and we have done much better actually than other areas of the north. So we've scored much more highly in both the northeast and Yorkshire and Humber.
Okay, thanks for that. I dread this index being used for allocating government funds then.
So I think what's quite interesting as well is that when you look at what's happened with the allocation of certainly levelling up funding, the northwest has had a lot of levelling up funding. But I think in terms of how it could be used for some of that, I think it's a within region allocation potentially. So if there's funding that's allocated for the northwest, where should that funding be spent in the northwest?
Okay, thanks for that.
Well, thank you, David, and thanks, Christine. And obviously, it's the idea of that composite bringing together also, access to various infrastructures, etc. So all of those different measures being brought together, I think that can perhaps then, bring different results than people may anticipate. But next up, Stuart Marshall, I have enabled your camera and your mic. So if you'd like to ask your question. And after Stuart, then Cliff also, and I see you're ready, Cliff. But Stuart, if you'd like to come in first of all.
Grand. Just check, can you hear us, Andrew?
I can, yes.
Brilliant, fantastic. We've just been having some issues. Really good. Thank you so much for the presentation, both speakers. It's so good to see this start to build into UK resilience, because 20 years ago it's been done internationally, but to start to see it come into local areas, great. question, I guess, is this so big and there's so many different projects or potential to build matrices and indexes and similar? I suppose a question really for yourselves is, do you see, is there a focal point in the UK for this work? Just thinking about the potential for lots of LRFs to go off and do different things and the sharing of learning and process. Andrea, you mentioned something around sense checking with communities, which is something I'm really keen on. I think every LRF on the call is probably going to go, that's brilliant, but we need to smash it below the local authority level to get to really kind of discrepancies within the geographic area. Any thoughts from yourselves as to where this might progress to, given it's relatively early stages for us all? Is there anything you've sort of identified and thought, this is the way we need to take this?
Yes, Andrea, if you'd maybe like to go first on that, and then obviously Christine, you can come.
Yeah, I think we all have a need to actually identify where social vulnerability lies. I think, you know, identification of social vulnerability is kind of paramount. In our case, this whole process was dictated literally by a lack of resources, and also to the need of focusing on the 20% of the population, the one most in need. I mean, our process, we're very aware that it's very rudimental and it's not complex, but this is why we actually went that way, because we didn't have the resources to actually go for anything more expensive. So we had to literally look around us and find, okay, what data can we use to actually create some projection that will guide us, you know, towards those areas. And then obviously, as I said in my presentation, that analysis is not enough. You then need to start a process of engagement with the local authorities, which is actually very complex at times, because obviously they are busy and they don't have the time or the resources themselves. But somehow, you know, you need to kind of start to get that conversation going, because it's necessary to have everyone involved, you know, the whole of society approach as it is. Great logo, great, you know, as a statement is great, but the reality of it is very different, and as you may be aware. So, but you know, you just have to be persistent. And if the local authority doesn't want to help, then you have to start seeking alternatives, and that's what we're doing in Kent. So, you know, because the local authority won't have necessarily all the answers when it comes down to community resilience, you can find them, you know, with the VCR sectors and other forums. So that's my advice.
So, Christine, if you'd maybe like to come in just on Stuart's question.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, I agree with what you said, Stuart, and I think any measure like this is a starting point, and hopefully a starting point for further conversations. And I think that local engagement bit is key. So I might have put something similar to that in the chat, but I think, again, from some local authorities that I've kind of talked to around this and shared the data with, they would see it as a starting point. So what they could do is they could go into the tool, they could see how they scored compared to other areas. They could also break down, use that indicator scorecard to actually break down and see within their local area what are the things that they've ranked better on, what are the things they've ranked less well on. Now that might give them a starting point to say, well, these are the areas that we might want to focus on. But the next step on from that would be to do some engagement around it. So I think you're right, this isn't going to give all the answers, but I think what I hope that the Community Resilience Index offers is a kind of almost like an evidence-based conversation starter, if you like, because we haven't had this before. We haven't been able to compare the scores in a like-for-like way across the country. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Christine, and thank you, Stuart. So it's great to see so many hands raised. So next up is Cliff in London, and after Cliff, Phil Baker. So go ahead, Cliff.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much, Christine, Andrea. Really interesting work. Andrea, I can clearly see parallels to our climate risk maps in London and some of the work that we've been doing to look at particularly like overlaying vulnerabilities on flood risk and heat risk, as we try to understand where in particular we should focus on as well. And we, I guess a big caveat, Christine, to the work so far, and as you said, it's a good starting point, but in London, we use LSOA level data, because LSOA is far more specific within a local authority area. And you can see from the tool, and the caveat Stuart mentioned this, but within a local authority, in London here, we have huge divides within an area. So say on this tool, Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea might come, you know, totally fine. We're really positive. It's really great. But actually that borough is extremely divided. The north of that borough is really has many challenges. And as we saw with the Grenfell Tower fire disaster, was not particularly resilient. So there's some hiding, you know, if you just look at local authority data, of areas that might be highly at risk. And that makes that if anything like this is used for funding or anything similar, it makes it a really high risk model to do that. Because if, for example, we chose in London, oh, actually, we should only focus on the boroughs listed as the most highly at risk on this tool, we would maybe miss out some of the communities that are the most at risk within London from disaster, because actually within Royal Borough, Kensington and Chelsea are pretty well off, are fairly resilient compared to the north of the borough, which would have a lot less resilience. Even talking with the local authority, that would definitely be the case. And in our LSOA data, that would show up really clearly as well on many indicators. So I wonder, I guess, Christine, how we could be even more detailed. Like, can it go even more specific than local authority area? Because it's for us in London, it wouldn't be so helpful being on a local authority boundary basis. And many communities, other LRFs may experience this as well, go across boundaries of boroughs, and a borough boundary is not helpful at all in understanding that community. So we have to be really careful about kind of borough boundaries, local authority boundaries here. But a really interesting starting point, and it's a good way, Christine, you described this as kind of a starting point. So I guess my question is, how more detailed can this get? And Andrea, it would be great to catch up sometime looking at what you've done and what we're doing in London and comparing notes.
Yeah, by all means.
Go ahead, Christine.
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely understand what you're saying in terms of that, and I think it is a limitation that this is done at local authority district level, for a couple of reasons. So, I mean, most people would not identify that as a community. I live in Trafford. I wouldn't say I feel like I'm part of a community of Trafford. So in terms of, you know, when we're talking about community resilience and people feeling like they belong to a place, most people would not identify that as their local authority. And also for the very valid reasons you said about variations within local authority boundaries as well, which I completely get. I suppose I see part of this is there should be some kind of, you know, let's say this funding was within an area or within a region, and there's some decision about how that funding is allocated. Those kinds of things happen already based on local authority district levels. So obviously the funding that comes to the local authority itself, but also if you look at how levelling up funding was allocated, a lot of that was based on competitive bidding, but there was also some needs-based allocation, and that was generally worked out at a local authority level. So it already happens, and I think part of that is then once that funding, let's say, is allocated to a local authority district, how do the people then with that local knowledge decide where in that district that funding, you know, how that funding is going to be distributed according to need? So I think longer term, if we had the data quality to do this at a lower geographical level, that would be the right thing to do. But if we don't have the data quality, then it's kind of stretching the data, if you like, just to break it down into smaller terms, and you're kind of just averaging out the same figures over smaller areas. So I think it is a challenge of having the data, but I think it's also about how we involve local decision makers in that. In that if the money's coming to your borough, then it's for your borough to decide how that's spent. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I think that there's a plethora of challenges in using this for funding decisions, I think, and that's been kind of recognised. But I hear what you're saying, Christine, about some funding decisions already being made on kind of local authority area data. But I guess that all of this work just needs like a really big asterisk of like, yes, but ... please do your homework, look at local differences, look at where communities are based, do some local research. Don't just use this tool as the kind of be all and end all. And I think that's, I guess, really important. And it's interesting you talk about the difference, how you stretch that data and move that data, what data is going to be helpful at a more local basis versus what data is only held at kind of a local authority level. Probably definitely would need to be investigated in any further discussions on that. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Well,
thanks, Cliff. And just to say, I do, you know, I mean, I kind of work in public health. I understand the picture that you're saying about local inequalities. I get that entirely. But that also doesn't take away, though, that at a local authority level, we have huge variation. And we do have some local authorities overall that are scoring a lot higher than other ones. And even that doesn't mean that there aren't pockets of inequality within one area, but looking globally at that measure, there are differences.
Thank you, Christine. So if I can move on now in terms of questioner to Phil Baker, and then after Phil, Sasha Taylor will be next. So go ahead, Phil.
Hi all. I work for the British Red Cross in the evaluation team. First of all, to say thank you to brilliant presentations. My question is for Christine, and it's kind of in two parts. The first one will be, I know you talked about it being open source data. Do you see this, how often do you see this being updated? Thinking with kind of an intervention lens, I'm thinking how can we track the work we do and see what impact that has on this data and the kind of, the maps that we see. And second of all, given that you've got fantastic sub-indices and indicators and the weightings of them, and given the questions we've already had, do you see that as something that we can do on a more granular level? Can we take these indicators? Can we ask those questions in kind of rigorous data quality methods to do that ourselves, and kind of use your process and make it more granular? How do you see that working?
Phil, I'd love to have that conversation. I think we've done this as kind of part of a research study. So in that sense, it's a one-off, if you like, of actually the research is almost like a proof of concept of how this has been adapted, what indicators we've used, etc. All of that is out there. If you've not come across it, there is a GitHub site that has all the data sat within it. Very happy to have that conversation and, you know, work with others as to say, how could we repeat it? How could we, very happy to do any of that.
Thank you.
I'll put my email in the chat, Phil.
Thank you. And Phil, in case you haven't seen it, in the chat is the link to, I presume, Christine, the link that you provided to me in advance is the link you were referring to, the GitHub for the underlying data.
I think the tool has a link to the GitHub repository. Okay. Yeah, yes. where the data is sat. Yeah.
So that's further up in the chat, Phil, and for others interested. And obviously, Andrea, you also mentioned in terms of the open access data. So obviously drawing upon the existing publicly available data sets and obviously their applicability in terms of how often they're updated is really based on whichever organization is doing it and how often they update.
Yeah, I mean, presents certainly a problem. The fact that the data is not going to be updated for a decade. But then again, you can still use it, I think, just to get those preliminary, to get a sense of where your work should go. And then I reiterate the fact that, you're going to need more work to actually establish what the actual situation is on the ground, which means, talking to practitioner of community resilience, community work, help people working with health, and, so where you look at, I think you can't just use the data. You will have to kind of start to engage with people on the ground to actually get better answers.
Well, thank you. So if I can come, first of all, in terms of a next question to Sasha, and then after Sasha will be Glenn McKnight. So Sasha, please go ahead.
Sorry, Andrew, before Sasha comes in, can I just add one thing to that before I forget? That I have been contacted by one of the local insight teams, because I think, Andrea, you mentioned local insight as well,
yeah.
Asking whether they could incorporate the Community Resilience Index data into their local insight. And I have said, absolutely, yes, you're very welcome to do that. So if anyone else is interested in doing that as well, all the data that you need should be there on the GitHub site. So do feel free to incorporate it into your own local tools as well.
Well, thank you, Christine. So Sasha, if you'd like to go ahead.
Thanks, Andrew. Mine is a comment, really, or an observation. Having seen both presentations, I was really excited to learn about the Community Resilience Index for England. I've obviously been working with Andrea on the report that we've been doing locally in Kent and Medway, and I did have a sneak peek at it while this webinar's been going on, at the index there, the interactive tool. And it just really confirms that the three critical areas that we've indicated in our Kent and Medway study are showing as sort of areas sort of in the top 5 of the southeast. So it does support our argument that we are going in the right direction. It's quite a relief to see those, that the work that we've been doing on a local level, using obviously national data, also sort of correlates on the study. And I think we'd be both very keen to learn more about the sort of evidence in those the scores and the weighting for each of the indicators. When you get down to a sort of a local authority level, to be able to understand them a little bit more, what it actually means, what the numbers actually mean in terms of the indicator described, just so that we can sort of have that as a supporting argument. We are, as Andrea said, it really is a starting point for us, sort of like, rather than just putting a pin in the map and deciding that's where we're going to focus our resilience study, or intervention. And because it does require a multi-agency, organisational input, so we do have to start somewhere in building that argument of the whys. Why are we choosing those areas? And even so, so if we look at an area like Swale, it's massive, and we know that there are areas that are really resilient there. They have resilient plans, they've exercised them, they've had them for years, they have the volunteers to do it. But it's the areas outside of that, that don't have that, and that's what we're interested in, and that's where we want to focus our research and the further work to try and understand those communities. So as many probably will be knocking on your door, Christine, I think Andrea and I will be too. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sasha. And there was no conferring in advance, so it's relief in terms of the areas overlapping between your work in Kent and obviously Christine's. You obviously mentioned, Sasha, then in terms of the multi-agency, but I guess also the multidisciplinary, and Andrea already alluded to at the beginning of his presentation in terms of the GIS analysts, and then clearly, obviously, Christine, with your sort of statistical and sort of quantitative knowledge. I very much am a social science kind of background, so it's then marrying up these kind of two ways of doing things, I think, is obviously to create something kind of vital in terms of our work on societal resilience, and we need all of these kind of disciplinary and multi-agency perspectives. So if I could then move on to our next sort of question from Glenn. Glenn, you're up next, and then after Glenn is Sophie. So go ahead, Glenn.
Good morning. Glenn McKnight from the Executive Office in Northern Ireland. Just want to say, first of all, 2 great pieces of work. Very, very interesting. Specifically on the Community Resilience Index for England. I love a good dashboard with data on it, so I really appreciate it. It looks great, especially in dark mode. I have to say, I mean, we're working on something similar for Northern Ireland. You know, there's been talk about producing a vulnerability index for Northern Ireland. Obviously, we have Section 75 obligations as well. So just as a more of a comment than a question, to be honest, great piece of work, and I think you probably set a benchmark for what we'll try to replicate in NI.
Thanks, Glenn. And I think ideally we would have done this for the whole of the UK, but that was just a bit of a stretch too far for this first piece of work. But what I hope, and I think I put a similar comment in the chat to someone who'd asked this about Scotland, I think that the indicators that we've chosen for England would be very similar, if not the same, for all of the UK. So, you know, certainly feel free to use that as a framework. And, you know, most of the work in actually developing this was the systematic review, all the background work, working out all the methodology, choosing the indicators, but that's kind of all been done. Actually, the work in just, you know, finding the data, because it's all from nationally available data sources, it's actually the smaller part of the work, if that makes sense. So I hope that even though we don't have the data from Northern Ireland in it, that it could perhaps help you in being able to skip some of that background work, if you like.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
And Glenn, just before you go, obviously you mentioned Section 75. Would you like to give just a quick, just a very quick explanation for those not familiar?
For those who are not familiar, so Section 75 of the Good Friday Agreement gives a responsibility to the Northern Ireland government to do equality impact assessing based on certain characteristics, religion, race, etc., gender, etc. So we would regularly equality screen pieces of policy and legislation against that, and a tool like the Community Resilience Index would be something that would be added to that screening process.
Well, thank you very much, Glenn. As many of you will have detected, I'm also from Northern Ireland, but Glenn did a much better job than I could have in terms of explaining Section 75. So thank you. So Sophie, if you'd like to ask your question up next, and then after Sophie, John Van Gorth. So I think I see Sophie. You should be able to on mic.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, thank you both so much. I found this really interesting. I've been a 10-year academic on community resilience, and since a year I'm working as emergency planning officer. So I found it very interesting to look at it from both perspectives. And I have to say, Christine, stellar job on developing this index. It's not easy to do, and it sounds like you've done, you've gone through all the paces for it. I think I want to kind of echo what Clifford Fleming earlier said about London, and that is that I really do think there's a need for that asterisk. I am also worried about the way in which government might look at this, and that they might take it, what is a very good but relatively blunt instrument, and take it as a basis for decision making. I would be very pleased and relieved if there could be, for example, on your GitHub, if there could be a bit of a disclaimer of this is how this should be used as an opening, as a starting point. This is the additional kind of means you could use, focus groups, all that kind of thing. And the other thing I was really looking at was table 3, which is your table of sub-indicators, which I found really interesting. And I think here is a little bit where the emergency planning side of me now comes out, because, for example, some of those indicators are, again, a little bit blunt. These are indicators like, for example, religious affiliation. Well, just to give you an idea, in my communities, the religious institutions, the church, I have a mostly rural county I work for, and most of the churches, they are pretty much empty on a Sunday. But when they're full is when they are hosting their baby and toddler groups. And 3/4 of the people who then attend are not people who have any religious affiliation, but that is the only organization, the only thing that runs in the village. So religious affiliation doesn't really matter. What matters is there still a church, a mosque, a temple operating, yes or no? Doesn't matter how many people go, because they might not attend for religious purposes. So I think it's these kind of a little bit more granular understandings of these particular kind of indices, you know, of these indicators, these factors, and how they can actually work. And again, maybe having some kind of asterisk there again, saying like, oh, you know, religious affiliation might mean a lot in some instances. However, you know, there's also another way you could look at this. So I very much echo that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sophie. Christine, and then Andrea, I don't know if you wanted to come back on Sophie's point.
I'll just say that these are very good points. There's really not much to add. I think, yeah, what she said is true. You know, those need to be used with you know, with care, with due care. This information, I think, is as we've been saying throughout this webinar. Both approaches needs to be seen like a starting point, you know, something to kind of guide you through very turbid waters to kind of get an initial understanding of where your intervention needs to be. But then, you know, you need to speak with focus groups, communities, faith leaders, just to kind of complete that picture, because we simply don't have that data. That data needs to come from work on the ground, you know, working with your stakeholders, with your partners on the ground, with the VCS sector, which obviously would be of primary importance. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I should also point, obviously, I know that some people seem to be having some issues in terms of adding comments to the chat, but some comments are coming through. So I just, in terms of some of that more localized data, I see a comment from Carl, Resilient Cities Network, just talking about the Gini index indicator. And obviously, you know, where more localized data collection then may be relevant. So obviously there are obviously data collection implications in terms of more localized quantitative type data, but then clearly a lot of our conversation is around, you know, actually, you know, speaking with people in the more qualitative interactions, you know, with individuals and communities, etc. So if I could then come and we're doing really nicely. We're making our way through the different questions. So and we have just over with 13 minutes remaining. So John, I noticed, John, that you had to come back in to the space. So hopefully your internet connections is working okay, but you're up next in terms of your question.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Yeah.
I can, yes.
Yeah, so just a thank you to both the speakers for sharing. Similar to a lot of the questions I think we had around how this is used or must be used, I'd argue, as that starting point that Andrea and Christine were talking about. It was a point, but I was really interested if Andrea or Christine have done this or thought about this around the idea of statistical neighbours. So looking within a local resilience forum or within a local authority area and looking at an entire nation and being able to say, okay, well, this particular local authority, given certain indicators, their statistical neighbour is X, and that could be the other side of the country, and be able to use, I think, networks like NCSR and others like the VCS Emergencies Partnership to be able to say, okay, well, I need to engage that particular team or that particular VCS team. So yeah, just interested if Andrea, you are maybe thinking about using that across Kent, and then Christine, if you've had any similar kind of thoughts across how the data sets can be used across England.
Yeah, I can start by saying, John, thank you for your question, by the way, that me and Sasha, we already decided that we will be in touch with you. In fact, I think I sent an email over Adam, but he's such a busy boy that he hasn't replied yet. But yeah, we're looking to start discussion with you, particularly in those 3 areas identified by our study, where we can start to initially get a better picture of what the situation is on the ground with the voluntary sectors. And we already have some information, but would like to kind of share this with you to see if what we have is updated, and then to gather any additional insights that you may be able to provide to help us to paint that local picture. So it's going to be a phased process where, the first phase will be, again, data gathering, assessment, and then the next phase will be, how do we connect these dots? What kind of synergy we can create at local level? What kind of community project works, what doesn't. We already have to accept that there will be already some good work there. So can we use this as best practice? Can we maybe link them up with someone else that needs that kind of support? So yeah, discussion with you guys will be essential, and we're looking forward to it.
Go ahead, Christine.
Thank you. So I think in terms of the national picture, I'll put a link in the chat. I'm not sure. Well, so there's already a model of nearest neighbours in England, nearest neighbour local authorities. So I haven't. It looks like that's kind of like a bespoke product, if you like, in terms of those groupings. But certainly, if you already know who your nearest neighbours are, then you could pick them out of that data set to do a comparison, if you like, because all of the local authorities are in there. And I think it is, it's a legitimate way to try and compare, to look at places that are similar to you and to see how they're performing. And I think because we do have this pattern of differences between rurality and different if you're on a coast, it kind of might make sense to pick out similar places and compare them rather than comparing within a region or within an LRF. But hopefully all the data is there to enable you to do that if you know your list of nearest neighbours.
Well, thank you, Christine. And obviously that issue around the boundaries is clearly, highly significant to all of our work, whether it's in relation to data or whether it's in relation to obviously working with different agencies, different groups, organizations, and networks. That whole idea and need to boundary span is clearly kind of highly significant in doing kind of partnership workings and collaborating together that we're obviously all trying to do in our different ways. So I have a final question from Paul. And now, Paul, I know you've added a comment to the chat, so I'm not sure if you're in Rochdale or elsewhere, but maybe if you'd just like to introduce yourself and your question. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Andrew. My name's Paul O'Hara. I'm a lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University, Andrew. So I think we're practically neighbours on Oxford Road. I just wanted, I did add a comment in about some work that we undertook in Rochdale, and what we did there was something quite similar. We used social vulnerability indexing to look at 2 contrasting areas in Rochdale. So we drilled down quite deep into the data, but we came across all of those same methodological challenges about getting data to marry up with each other, and also about the granularity of the data. So one thing we found was that even if we went into census data output and super output areas, we were still missing some of the details, because what we found was in Rochdale, a row of terraces would potentially flood, but the differences in the resilience or the vulnerability of even neighbours actually was significantly, varied significantly. I suppose we were only interested in Rochdale, so we were in 2 areas in Rochdale as well. So we were able to drill down to some of the local intelligence that the local authority had, in terms of individual properties that had flooded, how much they'd received in grant schemes. We were also able to identify whether or not households had were accessing benefits. Now, there are issues around data sharing and confidentiality there, but again, we were able to zoom a little bit back out and then begin to report that. So I have provided a couple of links to that, but I think what would be really interesting is if we could maybe get together and have a look at the data for Rochdale and compare and contrast with what we've got, because I know that what we've got isn't perfect. So any way of kind of improving that data, but also as a way of maybe, you know, ground truthing or having a different perspective on the data, for example, Christine, that you have. I thought that's not really a question, it was just a comment. Hopefully we can pick this up because I think, well, Christine, Andrew and myself, we're fairly local to each other, so maybe we could get together and have a chat about that a bit further.
Well, thank
Paul,
you,
very,
Paul.
very happy to do that. So, sorry, Andrew.
No, you go ahead, Christine, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, very happy to do that. Yeah, I work in Rochdale as well, so it'd be good to have that conversation. And I think what you said just then kind of reminds me as well, almost in the next steps around some of this, because the way that the Community Resilience Index was constructed was at an area level, and that area was local authority districts, and we've heard a lot about some of the challenges around that. I think the other really big development with this would be able to actually construct it at individual level using individual data, and then to kind of build up from individual level as well. So rather than looking at the proportion of people who are receiving benefits, you'd actually look at that at an individual level and then build your index up in a different way. And I think in doing it that way, you could potentially get a much more accurate picture at a much more granular level, but we'd need very different data to be able to do that.
And it sounds like obviously a good conversation point at some point in the future offline. And thank you very much, Paul, for providing the links in the chat, and obviously then for making the introduction. And like, many of the NCSR webinars in the past, they are very much about kind of making those connections and people being able to network and then be able to take whatever conversations forward then outside of the webinar itself. So I think if I could just ask people to give virtual claps to both Christine and Andrea for coming and presenting, and then the really very fulsome kind of Q&A session that we've had. Also, thank you to all of you for coming. I know, John, if your hand is up, I think that might have been a mistake. Just to then underline the upcoming events. The next webinar will be on the 20th of November, where we will hear from kind of a number of hyperlocal groups. And obviously that will then give us an opportunity to look at things from a slightly different perspective again. And all of these different perspectives are obviously extremely valuable then in relation to our work on whole of society resilience. If you haven't already registered for the third national conference in Manchester next March, please do so. The links are also in the chat, and it's really then just to give you a final thank you for coming and interacting. The recording of this webinar will be made available via the NCSR web pages at some point later this week, so you can obviously share it with your networks. But a big thank you, and I look forward to seeing you all at the webinar next month. So thank you.